What was your rank, secretary? The whole table laughed. I smiled because I'd heard worse from better men. Then a retired 3-star Army general stopped eating, turned in his chair, and stared at me like he'd just seen a ghost. That was the moment everything started. Not when my brother-in-law made the joke. Not when the general recognized me. The real beginning happened much earlier that day, around 7 in the morning, when I was helping my father climb into my truck outside his house in Decatur, Alabama. "Damn knees," he muttered. He always blamed his knees. Not the arthritis, not the fact that he'd spent 40 years crawling under diesel engines. Just his knees. My father, Earl Quinn, was 73 and stubborn enough to argue with gravity itself. "Easy," I said, keeping one hand on his elbow. "I got it." He clearly didn't. But arguing with him was like arguing with weather. You weren't going to win. I got him settled into the passenger seat and drove him to a VA appointment in Huntsville. The waiting room was packed with veterans. Some sat quietly. Some talked about fishing. Some compared medications the way teenagers compare sports stats. Getting older seemed to come with an entire new vocabulary. Blood pressure, joint replacements, physical therapy, sleep studies. My father complained about all of it. Then he complained about the coffee. Then he complained about the parking lot. Honestly, hearing him complain was comforting. It meant he was still fighting. By the time I dropped him back home and headed toward my own house, I was already tired. My husband Tom met me at the door. "Still on for tonight?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. His father's birthday dinner. 75th birthday. Big family gathering. Restaurant downtown. Too many people. Too many opinions. And unfortunately, too much Kevin. Kevin Caldwell was Tom's older brother. If confidence could be bottled and sold, Kevin would have been a billionaire. He sold commercial insurance and somehow managed to turn every conversation into a speech about himself. The worst part wasn't that he liked attention. It was that he liked audiences. Family dinners were his favorite stage. "Maybe he'll be in a good mood," Tom said. I looked at him. He laughed. "Yeah, I didn't believe it either." Around 6:30 that evening, we arrived at Cotton Row. The restaurant sat right in downtown Huntsville, warm lighting spilling across polished wood floors. The smell of steak and roasted garlic floated through the dining room. Tom's parents were already there. His sister Diane was there, several cousins, a few family friends, and Kevin, of course. Kevin stood the second we walked in, not because he was happy to see us, because he was in the middle of telling a story and needed a larger audience. "Tom," he shouted. Half the restaurant probably heard him. We sat down. For the first 20 minutes, everything stayed relatively peaceful. People talked about grandkids, retirement, property taxes, football, the usual. Then somebody asked me how retirement was treating me. That was all Kevin needed. "Retirement," he said. "You weren't old enough to retire." A couple people chuckled. "I left active duty," I said. "Same difference." I smiled politely. Tom took a sip of water. I recognized that look. He was already preparing for impact. Kevin leaned back in his chair. "So what exactly did you do in the Army?" There it was. The question. People ask that question all the time. Usually they're curious. Kevin wasn't curious. Kevin was hunting. Mostly flew helicopters. Helicopters. He sounded disappointed, like he'd expected a less interesting answer. "Blackhawks." "Oh." He nodded dramatically. Then he grinned. "So what was your rank?" I could already feel where this was heading. "Why?" "Just wondering." "No, you aren't." The table laughed. Kevin pointed at me. "See, that's what I'm talking about." "What?" "You always answer questions with questions." I learned from professionals. More laughter. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd move on. Instead, Kevin took another sip of beer. Then he fired the shot. "What was your rank, secretary?" The table exploded. Not everyone, but enough. A few cousins laughed. A family friend nearly spit out his drink. Kevin looked delighted with himself. Tom immediately set down his fork. "Kevin," I touched his wrist. "Let it go." I wasn't embarrassed. Honestly, I was tired. Tired people don't waste energy on every insult. I smiled. Then I said the first thing that came into my head. People usually stood when I entered the room. The laughter doubled. Kevin slapped the table. Oh, that's good. A couple people shook their heads. Someone said, listen to her. I just picked up my water glass. Across the room, a server accidentally dropped a tray. Plates clattered. Several people jumped. Without thinking, I looked over and said, easy. Breathe first, then move. The young server froze for a second, took a breath, then started cleaning up. Problem solved. I turned back toward the table and noticed something strange. An older man at a nearby table was staring at me. Not casually. Not because he'd overheard the joke. He was staring the way people stare when they're trying to remember something. His silver-haired wife said something to him. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back. The room suddenly felt smaller. The man stood, tall, straight-backed, despite his age. There was something familiar about him. Not personally, professionally. Like seeing an old photograph you haven't looked at in years. He walked toward our table. Kevin noticed him first. His grin faded. The man stopped beside us. For a few seconds he simply looked at me. Then he smiled. Not a big smile. The kind that comes from certainty. Havoc. Every muscle in my body locked up. Nobody at the table understood why. But I did. I hadn't heard that call sign spoken aloud in years. The man studied my face. Then he asked quietly, "Are you still using that call sign?" The restaurant noise seemed to disappear. Kevin stopped smiling. Tom looked confused. My heart was suddenly beating much faster than it should have been, because standing beside our table was retired Lieutenant General Frank Holloway. And somehow after all these years he remembered me. The past I'd spent years avoiding had just walked into my dinner. And it wasn't leaving. I didn't answer General Holloway right away. For a few seconds, I just sat there with my hand wrapped around a water glass, feeling the cold sweat gather beneath my fingers. Havoc. That name did not belong in a nice restaurant in downtown Huntsville. It belonged in radio static. It belonged in dust. It belonged in a part of my life I had packed away so carefully, I almost convinced myself it stayed packed, because I was healed. That was a lie. Kevin looked from me to the general, then back to me. "Wait," he said. "You two know each other." General Holloway's eyes stayed on mine. We crossed paths. That was such a military answer. Short, clean. Barely anything in it, but heavy enough to bend the table. Tom leaned toward me. "Maris." I could hear the question under my name. "Who is this man? Why does he know you? Why do you look like somebody just opened a grave?" I made myself breathe. "General Holloway," I said. He nodded once. "Ma'am." That one word changed the temperature at the table. Not because he said it loudly. He didn't. But men like Frank Holloway didn't hand out respect for decoration. Even Kevin understood that much. Kevin cleared his throat. "General, huh?" Holloway glanced at him. "Retired." "Right, sure, retired general." Kevin tried to laugh, but it came out thin. Diane, Tom's sister, stared at me with her fork halfway to her mouth. My mother-in-law looked like she had just found out the quiet woman bringing deviled eggs to Easter had once robbed banks. Tom's father, the birthday man himself, sat very still. He was a retired school principal. He knew authority when he saw it. Holloway gave me a small nod. "I didn't mean to interrupt your family dinner." "It's all right," I said, though it wasn't. His wife waved from their table with a gentle smile, clearly used to this sort of thing. Men from the old life, seeing other people from the old life, and forgetting for 1 minute that civilians don't know the rules. Holloway looked like he wanted to say more. He didn't. That was another thing I respected about him. "Good to see you, Colonel Quinn." The title hit the table harder than Kevin's joke had. "Colonel." Nobody laughed that time. Holloway returned to his seat. I stared down at my napkin. Tom's hand found mine under the table again, but this time he didn't squeeze. He just rested it there. Kevin was the first one brave enough or foolish enough to speak. "Colonel." I picked up my fork. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel, technically." "Technically, it's complicated." Kevin leaned back, blinking like I'd switched languages. "You said you flew helicopters." "I did." You didn't say you were a colonel. You didn't ask with any respect. Tom muttered, "That's fair." A cousin coughed into his napkin to hide a laugh. Kevin's ears went red. The rest of the dinner limped along after that. People tried to talk about normal things, but normal had left the building. Every conversation came with side glances. I could feel questions gathering around me like mosquitoes. What was Havoc? Why did a retired general call her ma'am? Why hadn't she told us? That last one bothered me most because it sounded reasonable. I could have told them. I just hadn't wanted to. On the ride home, Tom kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing until we were past Memorial Parkway. That told me he was choosing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "Were you going to tell me about the call sign? You knew I had one." I knew pilots had call signs. I didn't know yours made retired generals stand up at restaurants. I looked out the passenger window at the strip malls sliding past. A Walgreens, a barbecue place, a church sign advertising Wednesday Bible study. Real life, safe life, the kind of life I had fought to get back to. It wasn't like that, I said. Tom glanced at me. Then what was it like? I almost said nothing. I was good at saying nothing. Silence had gotten me through a lot of family dinners, VA hallways, and nights when sleep decided not to show up. But Tom deserved better than a wall. So I told him a little. Not everything. Just enough to open the door. I was a Black Hawk pilot first, I said. Then later I commanded a small aviation rescue task force overseas. Task force. Yes. That sounds bigger than mostly flew helicopters. It was mostly helicopters. He didn't smile. Neither did I. I remembered Fort Novacell before it had that name back, when everyone still called it Rucker. I remembered the heat coming off the tarmac like an oven door. I remembered being 24 and pretending I wasn't scared because the men around me were pretending the same thing. Flight school taught you machines. War taught you people. You learned who panicked quietly, who joked too much, who needed a hand on the shoulder, who lied and said, "I'm good," when they were anything but. My first deployment changed my voice. Not all at once, just little by little. I stopped wasting words. I stopped mistaking loud for strong. And then came the night that made Havoc stick. I still don't like telling it. There had been a sandstorm, the kind that turned the world brown and mean. Visibility was garbage. Communications kept breaking. A small